Great. So we are recording right now. So hello, welcome, good evening to everyone, maybe around the world. I don't know, but I'm excited to find out. My name is Sari. I'm the Public Programs Manager of MOFAD. For those of you that are joining a MOFAD program for the first time, welcome. It is wonderful to have you. This is our second panel event in our series, The Takeout, which is an online program series that has been started in the wake of COVID. It interrogates the impact of COVID on Asian and Asian American communities, specifically as they relate to food and drink, because that's what we do. We're MOFAD, the Museum of Food and Drink. It's especially exciting to have everyone right now in this time when we can't gather in person. Certainly, I think a silver lining of this moment is that there's so many ways to connect and opportunities that we normally wouldn't. There were 400 people who registered for this program tonight. Unfortunately, we had to cut it off because our Zoom plan only can accommodate so many. But I think there could have been more, which is an amazing thing, because in our tiny space in Williamsburg, New York, we can't fit anywhere close to that. And certainly we can't welcome people from all over the world. So it's just so wonderful to be able to find this global extended community in this time. So I really, really thank you for joining us. And I hope that if this is the first program that you're joining us for, it is not the last. Which leads me to ask and remind you all to please sign up for our newsletter. If you haven't, it comes out every week. It tells you all the different programs we have that are coming up. Like I said, this is a series. It's the second in this series, and we have several more on the horizon. So you're going to want to make sure that you know what's happening so you can sign up in time. But if your friends ask, or if you want to revisit this program, like I said, we are recording it and it will be up on our website tomorrow. So you're more than welcome if you have to dip out early, or if you want to share it with friends because you enjoyed yourself, please feel free to check out that recording. The chat function at the bottom of your screen is disabled right now for chatting to everyone. That's because we want to make sure the focus of this talk is on the speaker. So if you missed me saying it at the beginning, please make sure that your Zoom is on speaker view as opposed to gallery view. There's a little thing in the right corner of your Zoom screen. It looks like a little Rubik's Cube. You can click on that and change it from speaker view to gallery view and back. So speaker view is definitely recommended. What else? Yes, there will be a Q&A at the end of this talk. So because the chat function is disabled now, you cannot ask questions to the panel, but we will be turning it on at the end. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have anything that comes up, a burning question, please just make sure to jot it down. And then at the end, we'll open that chat function up so everyone can ask their questions. You can type them in with the chat, and then we'll be able to read them. So if for some reason you have this burning desire, please do not turn your mic back on and ask questions. Just save it, and we're gonna have them written at the end. Also wanted to let you know that MOFAD is going to be tweeting this panel during. So if you want to keep it up, if you want to keep the conversation going after the panel, you're more than welcome to join MOFAD on Twitter if you have any questions that weren't answered during the program. And also there's going to be an email that comes out to everyone tomorrow. I'll make sure if there's anything referenced that's important, that'll all be included in the email tomorrow. So not to worry about like writing everything down. We'll get it for you. So with that, I am so happy to start this panel. I want to have everyone introduce themselves one at a time. So first, I'm just going to go in the order that I can see people. Let's start with Sarah.
Everyone, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Nguyen. I'm the founder of Nguyen Coffee Supply. We are a Vietnamese coffee company focused on importing through direct trade green coffee beans and roasting in Brooklyn. Our mission is to increase the visibility and representation of Vietnamese coffee in the global coffee experience so that we can then increase the opportunities for farmers abroad to convert their current production from commercial to premium and specialty coffee production, which will then allow for increased opportunities for improved quality of life.
Soleil?
Sure. Hi, I'm Soleil. I am the restaurant critic of the San Francisco Chronicle. Yeah, that's all I do. Yeah, I'm really excited to be on this panel.
Frank?
Unmute now. Okay. Hi, my name is Frank Zhang. I'm a columnist with the LA Times. I write in Metro. My column is about just people of color in Los Angeles. And I also host a podcast called Asian Enough with Jen Yamato, because we make podcasts at our newspaper as well. So that's all.
Jenny.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Dorsey. I'm a professional chef, writer, and the founder of a nonprofit community organization called Studio Atao. We create different experiences and content at the intersection of food, art, and social impact. We're best known for a series that we've been touring across the US called Asian in America, which we actually debuted at the Museum of Food and Drink in 2018. That talks about the Asian American identity through food, drink, virtual reality, and poetry. And we also host industry conversations and turn them into toolkits and resources. We most recently came out with one about tokenization in food media.
Thanks. Zhang.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zhang. I am the founder of Fly by Zhang, and we make all natural, small batch crafted Chinese sauces, condiments, and spices. I was born in Chengdu, but I grew up all over, and I spent the last 10 years living in China, where I owned a restaurant that celebrated regional Chinese cuisines. I started Fly by Zhang after seeing a lack of high quality Chinese food products in the West that were widely available and accessible. And I wanted to also challenge some of the false narratives that really existed around Chinese food, and show that made in China can mean the highest quality ingredients that are also good for you too.
And I'm going to turn it over to Krishnendu to introduce himself and kick off the panel.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sari, and welcome everyone. This is a real pleasure and a privilege to be moderating this panel. And I'm just going to say a couple of things. First, about myself, I'm the chair of a department called Nutrition and Food Studies at NYU. Then broadly, the way I'm going to I think about today's panel is thinking, we will talk a little about experience on the panelists, and we will talk a little about the analysis, and we will probably end with some recommendations. Okay, my sound is bad. Let's see.
Christian is going to check on his sound.
Yep.
While he does that, everyone who just joined us, I'm going to repeat myself a couple times, and sorry for that. I just wanted to let you all know that there is going to be a Q&A at the end. So please just hold your questions until then. At the end, we're going to open it up. We're going to open the chat function up to everyone, and you'll be able to chat questions into everyone. But for now, just kind of keep them, jot them down. And just a reminder to please keep your microphones and your video cameras off. So should we try again, Krish?
Hey, perfect. Can you hear me? Can
Yeah.
you hear me now? Is it better? Perfect. Thank you. Okay, sorry for that. So, so as I said, we're going to organize it around experience, analysis, and maybe at the end, we will do some recommendations. And where I'm coming from with this question on disdain, disgust, xenophobia, is that sociologists have now argued that for the last 20 years, American food culture has become very omnivorous. And everyone is eating all kinds of food. In a sense, what happened to music? And so my bigger question is, have we reached a moment where, in fact, disgust, disdain, and the opposite of omnivorousness is become ubiquitous? Or is it that there has always been disgust and disdain along with omnivorousness? So that's kind of my big frame for me to think about it. And so I'm going to open up with a question that will end up with a specific question to Soleil. And but the bigger frame is this: how does disgust work in our world, and what does it do? To find that out, I would invite the speakers to think a little about, have you faced disgust or disdain about your food? And if you could give some examples of when where, and how did you react to it? And one thing I've heard repeatedly is the school cafeteria, lunchroom, is really a very fraught site, especially for children of immigrants, in some ways dealing with disgust and disdain. So with that in mind, I'm going to throw the first question to Soleil. Soleil wrote this kind of powerful piece on eating dogs, and something that happens unevenly, nationally and regionally, but is often flattened in the presumption, in the Orientalist presumption about the Oriental. Okay, so Soleil, if you could just, for us, for the audience, rehearse a bit of some of your arguments in that piece, and how would you write it? How would it be different if you were writing it today? I think you wrote that piece in 2018, if I'm correct. So 2 years later, after COVID-19, what does that piece look like if you're going to revisit it on eating dogs?
Yeah, so it was really funny to pitch that story to Taste, which is the outlet that put it out, because I said, like, they're a recipe site, you know. So to pitch the story about eating dog, it's not necessarily a recipe, but it's like a food site. You know, like usually food and cooking sites don't publish stories about food that most people don't want to eat. So that was risky, and I'm really glad that they said yes, because I wanted to really explore the ways in which dog eating was a cipher. It was like a symbol for all these other like bigger things. And of course, if you've read any of my writing, that's like generally my whole shtick, right? I love using food to talk about these like bigger issues, and that's why we're all here. So I talk about how the principle of dog eating, you know, begins as a question that a lot of people get, you know, when they're in diaspora of like, so your people eat dogs, right? Like, what's that like? Why do they eat dogs? And for a lot of us, like, we're the representatives of our diasporas, like, and, you know, for me, like, the answer was always no. I'd never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it as a Vietnamese American whose family's from the south of Vietnam. We don't do that there. But, you know, there's nuance to it, because the truth is people do eat dog. And having to reconcile with that truth and having to understand, like, okay, like, how do you say yes to this, but also like not, it's like a trick, right? If you say yes, then that means you're a barbarian, you're a savage, you're a piece of crap. So how do you say yes and introduce that level of nuance and that historical kind of mindset? So that was what the piece was about. So I talk about the history of the World's Fairs, for instance, in the West, and how, you know, in St. Louis, I believe, there was a Filipino village that was kind of airlifted over and recreated in the city. And there were like Filipinos, like indigenous Filipinos who were brought there, and like, you know, the newspaper would write about how there were dogs procured for their eating, and it was, you know, that was their spectacle. People would show up and watch them eat and dance and do their like indigenous things. And then, of course, like there's all of these things that happen over and over again, like the talk of the dog festival in China, in this one region, and how there are like petitions all the time about like stopping this festival that is not even in your own country. Somehow that is effective, and that happens. There's legislation that's introduced in the United States about this festival that is in China, which we have no power over and shouldn't have any power over. And then, of course, like there's these sort of cultural changes that happen within these countries that are known for this practice, like broadly, like South Korea, Vietnam, China. Like, it's a generational thing. It's an urban versus rural thing. It's a regional thing. So I try to tease out all of those differences, all those nuances. But at the end, I really thought it would be interesting to talk about the poverty narrative as well, of like, oh, well, one way we rationalize it is like, oh, people just eat it because they're desperate. Like, that's the food that's available, and that's what they, you know, can eat. So I talked to Andrea Nguyen, who's this wonderful cookbook writer and author, whose family's from North Vietnam and whose family craves dog. And I go into the sort of like sensory detail that you typically see in food writing about like spaghetti or, you know, beautiful like salads about dog meat. And it was a really uncomfortable kind of thing for me to tackle, but also I think really important just to bring out the fact that like people do it because they want to as well. And like all of these things can exist all at once. And in that way, hopefully, right, I tried to strip that practice of its like very like polarizing kind of narratives, to infuse a little bit more truth into it. But yeah, I guess that's the piece. And if I could do it again, I mean, you see the same thing, right, with like bats now with coronavirus and all this stuff, right? Like, you people eat bats. I'm sure many of us have heard that, like, yelled at us on the street. It's the same sort of practice, right, where this food is being used to otherize and being used to make an argument about us and like what we're about and what ills that we've enacted on the world. So if I were to write this now, though, I think I would have included a recipe.
That's beautiful. Okay, good. And crossing that threshold of edible, inedible, us and them, and also aestheticizing some of it. That's beautiful. Frank, I'm going to draw you out first. Do you have an experience of this meeting disgust or disdain towards your own food, and how did you react to it? And maybe illustrate it with an example from what you have written about.
Yeah, I think, you know, the sort of lunchbox story that a lot of Asian Americans have, like I sort of have a different one where it was Chinese New Year and my mom came to school and made fried rice for everyone, and everyone lost their minds. And everyone was like, this fried rice is like, oh my God. And for weeks I was getting compliments, you know, and everyone just loved me, you know, and like I was very popular because of this fried rice, you know. And fried rice is very accessible, so good on my mom for picking something successful. Like, I think that's like, when I hear a lot of those stories, I think that's one of the things that we don't understand necessarily, is that historically, you know, food is like one of the main ways in which immigrants have expressed themselves and tried to attain welcome and make a living, you know, in the United States. And because of that, you know, like many of the sort of clashes between American culture and immigrant culture have been in sort of food legislation, you know, and you know, for example, with like the roast duck law in the 1980s, you know, health inspectors were telling Chinese restaurateurs to throw out their ducks, and because they were keeping them at room temperature for too long, keeping them at room temperature also made them crispy and delicious. So you know, they had to change the retail food code to allow for that, you know, and so yeah, I guess it's something that just comes up a lot.
Excellent. And and maybe Jenny, do you want to give us an illustration of kind of meeting this disgust? And my question specifically to you, Jenny, is, does the acceptance of food lead to the acceptance of a people? Okay, so we have the chop suey craze in the 1920s, and we also have a certain kind of a politics that's operating. So in terms of an example, and then talk a little about this relationship between accepting the food that Frank, in some ways, Frank's example of fried rice is a good example of that, and the acceptance of a people.
Yeah, this is something I definitely talk about and kind of explore through my food. There's one dish in particular that I made last 2 years ago. It's called That's Disgusting, and it takes a lot of the ingredients that I grew up eating that was definitely called out in the lunchroom that was seen as gross. In particular, I always point to garlic chive. If you're not familiar with garlic chive, they're often used in dumplings. They're used in a lot of things in Chinese food. If they sit at room temperature for a good amount of time, but a lot of white audiences will say it tastes like or smells like farts. And that was something I like pervasively heard at school, is like, oh, your lunch is so gross and it smells. And then when I actually went and was studying at Columbia for my MBA, I literally had the exact same reaction from one of my classmates, 30 years later, which is kind of shocking. And so one of my dishes takes all of those things that used to be gross and makes them refined. It's served in a pretty way, it's presented in this fine dining-esque sort of scenario. And all of a sudden, because of how culturally we've also changed, Chinese food is cool now, that you can see there's a slight rise in, Chinese, Asian Americans and Chinese Americans and their social economic status, how China has developed as a global superpower, etc. But we are a little bit more accepting of Chinese food now, and now it's like cool. These foods are cool, and also because I've shown it to them in a more approachable way. So I think there's always this struggle of you want to be accepted, you want people to understand a nuance, as Soleil was saying, but there's also a how much nuance are they willing to delve into unless you give it to them in kind of a sugar-coated and approachable, in a fine dining-esque, in a whatever thing that gets them, whether that's writing recipes that, maybe you describe a few things or translate a few things in a certain way, whether that's presenting the food, or honestly, when we do events, many times the events are also, I don't say they're sugar-coated, but I put my message out there. People are listening to it in virtual reality. People are talking about it through the poems, but it's an easier way to digest. And there's always kind of this internal struggle of like, will they be willing to take all of it? Is it better if people accept 80% of it than 0% of it? And I think that's the struggle of people of color in general. I think that overall, I want to believe that as people accept the foods of another culture, they do accept the people as well, but I don't think that is necessarily a causation. There might be slightly correlated, but I think especially with recent scandals where it's unclear if that is a real one for one.
And in fact, that's a good segue to Sarah. I'm going to ask you this. When we were talking last time, and this is a nice segue to, so what's the difference between, say, is there one between curiosity, discovering, and Columbusing? And does it matter? And in kind of, is it in some ways a spectrum? And how do you think about, Sarah, how do you think about this thing about curiosity, discovery, and Columbusing?
Yeah, great question. Simple answer is yes, it does matter. There's a huge difference. I think that words are so powerful, and the words that we choose to express ourselves, to talk about other people and other cultures, it really sets a framework, and it also can set forth a power dynamic for how we have the rest of the conversation and how we hold other people in that conversation, right? So, for example, with the term of Columbusing, there's a clear power dynamic in that term of the conqueror and the conquered, right? And I think to say that, oh, I discovered something, is just really a euphemism for Columbusing, because even with the word I discovered also sets forth this dynamic of someone who discovered something new, and it's like the discovery and the taking and the sharing, right? Whereas, oh, I'm curious and I learned about the banh mi today, right? The word I learned sets forth a whole different power dynamic in relationship to that culture. It puts the person who learned from curiosity in a place of humility and of receiving, right, rather than taking, right? And it also puts forth the person who is sharing this culture, who has created this culture, in a position of authority, right, and of influence, right? So it's very subtle in a sense. Some people would say it's I discovered, I'm curious, but I truly believe that there's so much power in the words that we choose to express ourselves and talk about other people and other cultures, sets for a power dynamic for how we hold people and cultures and ourselves for the rest of the conversation and the rest of the experience that we create.
Excellent. And Jing, you are an entrepreneur, and you are marketing, you're selling both a cultural product and a commodity, okay? So tell us a little about what are your marketing challenges, especially specific to this moment, and specific to this, for what I see is a very interesting moment where I in fact thought that Chinese food, in fact, was going to climb very high, very fast, a lot like, say, Korean food and Greek food has been climbing over the last 30 years. And I in some ways, I'm unsure now, but we shall see. And so this act of translation and this tension between commerce and culture. So what are some of your challenges as an entrepreneur who is trying to position Chinese food, specifically sauces and chili oil?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's something that I've been, grappling with since starting the business. So xenophobia, like we make and sell Chinese food, and this kind of current xenophobic environment we've faced since the very beginning, since way before coronavirus. There's always been this narrative around Chinese food that it is cheap, low quality, unhealthy. And people have always loved to say to me, I can get this for $3 in Chinatown. Like, how dare you charge 5x this? And without any reflection on the fact that, like, on why they think it is that these foods don't warrant a higher price, or that the people who are making them deserve to profit off of their own creations. And yet when a Western chef makes it, oftentimes there is no question asked, why they can charge a much higher price for it. And there's also no thought that they're comparing me, to a company that is one of the largest corporations in China, with economies of scale, or that the ingredients that I'm using and the quality and the craft that's going into it is 5x what they're using, precisely because of the reason that they've been told that we're not willing to pay higher prices for the same products, right? And so these kinds of comments, which we've gotten from people, including Chinese and Asian people, who have for so long, I think, just had this ingrained into, their view of their own worth. And then, of course, when coronavirus happened, it just amplified to a more overt racist commentary, like, we don't want your coronavirus food. We are there bats and cats in your ingredient list? Like stuff like that, which, has been an interesting thing to have to deal with. And, everything from overt things like that to even micro things, like we were featured recently in the New York Times, and it was a glowing review of us, and it was a recipe developed for us, and the editors decided to name the article "Your Coronavirus Cooking Needs Condiments." And I found that really interesting, because I was shocked at first. I had a few emails come in and people are like, wow, what an unfortunate title. And I looked on the New York Times cooking site and looked at, other recipes that were, cakes, cookies. They all had the title, "Your Quarantine Cookies." Like, no one would ever think to say coronavirus cookies, but somehow somebody thought it was okay to call our Chinese sauce a coronavirus sauce. And so I had to email the editors and get that, and they did change it, only online, but not in print. But anyway, so these are kind of the things that we faced from the beginning. And the reason why we launched this business in the US is I'm actually Canadian, and I grew up all over the world, and spent the last 10 years in China. But the reason why we decided to move here to launch the business last year was because, food is a gateway to culture, and food media is, and media, really, American media does define a lot of culture globally. And so I knew that if I wanted to kind of start challenging some of these narratives, I needed to start in the US. And up until very recently, the voices in food media have been predominantly white. And that, as a result of gatekeepers, editors who were also white. So I'm really happy to see people like Soleil and Frank carving space for themselves in this area. But based on recent controversies, that we see that mainstream media still has a really long way to go, to including more nuance and authenticity in the voices and experiences that are being represented. So yeah, I mean, I would actually love to hear from everyone here, like Soleil and Frank, and if how they think the media has a responsibility to maybe better represent our cultural stories, to prevent, ethnic erasure in storytelling about food, and what all of us, because we're all, storytellers, whether it's through our cooking and restaurants or our products, and how do we represent our cultures? How do we tell our stories? And do people even care Or do they just want tasty food and delicious coffee? And not want to deal with the emotional labor of thinking about, where this comes from. And so what is that balance to strike? And from my perspective, so we try to break down barriers. That's the whole MO of our company. We are inviting people to the table and, to hopefully expand someone's mindset, and and sometimes we use like simple food porn to do that, right? To attract people on a very simple level at first. And sometimes we show our chili sauce on pizza, on ice cream, to further break down and provoke some of the challenges and challenge the assumptions that people have that, this sauce needs to only be served on Chinese food. I can only, go to a Chinese restaurant to have this. And then we also provide different levels of engagement. So people can pick and choose how deep they want to engage with us. So you can just buy it because you want a tasty hot sauce, or if you're an Asian American kid who finally feels more seen because of, us and other brands like us, that's awesome. And if you're white and you're introduced to this idea of the hierarchy of taste, which is like your work, Krishnendu, and examining maybe your unconscious biases that exist, which continuously debase Asian foods, culture, and its people, then that's great as well. But I'm just curious to hear from all of you, like, what your approach is here.
Okay, let's throw it to Soleil and then Frank. And in fact, maybe you can also elaborate on this. I was almost, before COVID-19, I was in the middle of writing a piece, which is partly a response when Virginia Woolf was asked, so when did modernism begin? And she gave a particular date, that it began on 1919. And for me, the fact that Frank and Soleil and Tejal Rao and is for me, 2020 is a radical transformation of a new cohort of people, and that's astonishing. And of course, this is always for outsiders, this is not good enough. For insiders, this is radical change. Okay. And maybe Soleil and Frank say a little about that, kind of your position in that world, who are transforming this field of restaurant criticism, which has been white and male. And it is very strongly Asian American now. And does it matter? Is it significant? Or you guys are not that important?
Well, in the scheme of things, like, I'm certainly not curing any diseases, but I think that it has been really interesting. Just the time that I started, right, at the San Francisco Chronicle was also at the same time that LA Times is relaunching its food section, with Patricia Escarcega as a food critic, along with Bill Addison. She's another woman of color, and I respect her a lot too. And then Tejal Rao got sent out to California, to LA, to cover the whole state, which is amazing. It's been really interesting. As someone who never thought I would be in this role to actually determine taste, which I think is the task of the critic, is to basically give people a sense of like what's okay, like what is allowed, what is permissible, what is good. Because as it turns out, a lot of people want to know. They don't want to find out for themselves. They just want to be told, and that's fine. That's an aspect of human nature that I've learned a lot about in the past year. But I think that it is really significant. I think just the fact that you can, for the most part, right, like at a baseline, you know that we are not going to instinctively center whiteness in what we write, and we're not going to do it without question or without guilt. Also, I think for the most part, right, like it can be a hard thing. We're trained to do this, right, from growing up in white supremacist culture. But I think that it's a learned thing. It's not like for us, like we're always, if we do it, we're like putting ourselves behind, right? But to actually privilege ourselves, to actually use our experiences as people of color as like the paradigm in which we're operating, I think is really significant. I think that it is very Asian. I think it could be much more Black and Latinx. But this is a step in a direction, and I hope that it steps outward in more directions as well.
And kind of just a quick question, and then Frank, do you also have to kind of fight against your own, to use an old Marxist term, embourgeoisement, right? Which is you are kind of pushed towards this upscale space, and is that struggle inside you too in representing it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting how like you're hailed, right, by culture, especially fine dining culture. It wants to claim you as a tastemaker or whatever. As someone who enters a space, it wants to make you feel like you belong. It's like a country club, right? When you're a member, you're granted all of these privileges and all of this acclaim, and it could be really easy to be seduced by that, you know. Going to any of these fine dining, like Michelin starred places, especially out here, it can be easy to be seduced by that. So yes, and it can be easy to also, I think, become arrogant, in the sense where, like, when I was hired, I think the shortcomings of representational politics became really clear to me, because I was often lauded as the savior, of food criticism or whatever, because of what I was rather than what I did. And to be satisfied in that, I could have been done and happy with that, rather than like actually espousing the politics that I do espouse. You know, I think that was a really clear difference in the kinds of reactions that I got and continue to get with my work.
Lovely. Frank?
First, I have to say that I'm not a food writer, and I would love to be. I have nothing against it. I work in the metro section, and most of when I write about food, it's just kind of me indulging myself, or that's sort of the direction of my curiosity is heading. But yeah, I mean, I definitely, like in my column, try to think about, you know, how to sort of center voices that are not, basically, I think like writing about, you know, people of color, writing about race, is writing about all the stuff that people have been too uncomfortable to talk about. And so that involves centering, you know, neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods and ethnic communities, and telling, you know, making my points with these people as the main characters. And so that's something I unconsciously try to do in my own writing. And I think it's something that every journalist of color has to sort of, it's a question that they have to answer for themselves. You know, how Asian am I going to be in my job? How much of a person of color am I going to be at my job? And everyone kind of comes to different decisions. But to me, I think being a journalist of color is acknowledging that the institution of journalism has done a terrible job, you know, covering people like you. You know, it has much to answer for. It has much to change, you know, and so you kind of start from this area of critique. And a lot of people say my column, you know, it doesn't have opinions in it. It's not like other people's columns. And I think it is what it is because it has to be that way. You know, I try to write as though, I try to do journalisms on terms that people of color can accept, you know, and it comes out differently. You know, it means that history is important because I might spend, you know, 6 paragraphs talking about a history because, you know, those words have not appeared in our newspaper before, you know, and so they need to. And I guess like kind of picking up the earlier conversation where we were talking about, you know, does food kind of lead to acceptance and belonging, you know? And I think like, I would say no, but I would also talk about this. I feel like there's been, you know, 3 periods. Like one period is when everyone thinks that Asian food is gross and they pass laws trying to ban everything. And another period is when it's fetishized, right? Fetishized is the most negative word that you come up with this, but it's basically enjoyed through a framework of authenticity and colonialism, where, you know, the delights of the world, instead of something that you hate now, is something that you can consume in order to be cosmopolitan. And, you know, I think that's still kind of the current state that we're in, and we're trying to reach a further state where, you know, we then can interact with food as cultural products, as things that include history and all of these other things. And Jet Tila kind of talks about this on his podcast, on our podcast, where he's a chef in Los Angeles whose parents opened the first Thai grocery store, and there's such an interesting story with their parents and how they imported the bird's eye chili peppers and illicitly planted them on the campus of UC Riverside. If you want to hear more about that, you should check out Mark Padongpat's book, Flavors of Empire. But yeah, he talks about how, in his book, how the introduction of Thai food in Los Angeles was a very interesting case. And one of the things I found funny about it is that it was marketed as a more flavorful Chinese food,
Oh, really?
And so that's like, not something we necessarily describe Thai food with accurately, but it did, Jet talks about educating the consumer's palate. He can start with this, Asian fusion thing, and then maybe he can take you to, Nam Prek Pao or something like that, And so I guess like in looking at this sort of this period where, food is this way where people understand Asian food the same way they understand Asian people, through an authenticity framework, and that's why whenever you tell a white person that, hey, I'm Chinese, then they cycle through a sort of litany of knowledge about Chinese and try out all the stereotypes on you. And, because they're still approaching, culture from this authenticity framework, and hopefully I think, with writing that centers these voices, I think we can move beyond that.
Frank, I'll go back. I'll draw your attention back to your first sentence, which you said, I'm not a food writer. Does that help you in not being, in some ways, I sometimes wonder, is the world of food so fussy, so precious, that in fact, sometimes food might be the bridge to another. And in some ways it has been so contaminated by kind of stereotypes and archetypes and preciousness and authenticity that in some ways it allows you more freedom than the rest of us who have to basically work with food. Do you think it helps or hinders?
I certainly enjoy myself and find it to, find that it's helpful to, use food. And just because I write about sort of Asians and Asian immigrants and Asian Americans a lot, and food ends up being sort of a lens to that you might not have before. So yeah, it is helpful. But the food media, and I'm not like really equipped to comment on it. It has evolved from, a certain. As food has grown more sophisticated, food media needs to grow more sophisticated. I think
I'm going to throw it to Zhang now. Before I go, one reaction from you. Do you like the word foodie or not?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, no.
Okay, good. That's it. That's
yeah.
it. That's good. Hey, Zhang, do you want to come in here and in some ways what you have heard so far, okay? What hasn't been articulated that you want to bring our attention to and the audience's attention to? Oops, you are muted. Can I do that? Let's see. There you are. Now,
okay.
Yes, perfect. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I don't know what happened to my screen, but there's like no buttons. I can only, it's really weird. So can you please help unmute and mute me? Yeah, no, I think, I think that was great. I mean, I'd love to hear from Jenny and,
Sarah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'd love to hear from you guys as well.
Jenny, do you want to talk a little about kind of issues that either provoked you to think or in some ways have not been raised so far?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk a little bit about kind of going back to this idea of like disgust and discomfort and what many times, at least anecdotally, I can say I've experienced as someone who often is serving that discomfort, potentially with some disgust, even though I like to think all the food that I serve is not disgusting, but it might provoke a sense of disgust. So for example, the dish I was mentioning earlier that takes a lot of these childhood stereotypes and ingredients that used to be seen as gross it comes served and it looks pretty, but it's served in a lunchbox and there's like a little, hello, my name is sticker on it. And it says, that's disgusting. And so now people are kind of grappling with their own complicity in maybe they were the perpetrator at some point who said that was disgusting. But B, also, do you now eat this item? This item that someone else has already proclaimed is disgusting, which is many times what a lot of those us as immigrant children we're dealing with is if someone calls your food and labels it for you and has an image of it for you, what is your reaction to it? Do you eat it in protest? Do you eat it as subserviently? How do you respond to that? And one other interesting thing about discomfort is that what I've seen over the years is many times people will react in one of two ways. They'll either dismiss it. They'll say, I didn't mean it. It was a joke. You're taking it too seriously. I think women hear this a lot too about separate issues. This is so PC culture, et cetera. You really need to just deal with it separately. Or there's a defensiveness and anger and a frustration of how dare you expose something of me that is uncomfortable for me to deal with. And instead of, I'm projecting it onto you because it's easier to deal with that way. And you see that with how people will react to, I guess, Jing sauces, unfortunately, or like the way that people will simply say behind your back or in small microcosms, microaggressions online, where they'll be like, I don't see what the big deal is anyway, they're overreacting, etc. So it's just very interesting to see how that's come through like full circle in the world of food and with food media. And I think we can also maybe have a conversation about tokenization a little bit later. And if we don't have enough representation in food media, those stereotypes and those ideas keep getting perpetuated because a primarily white writer will be many times experiencing those same feelings and expounding them through their work.
And of course, and that links to Soleil's first comment and our piece on dog eating, in a sense that it happens differently. It doesn't happen in other parts of Asia. And in fact, that's the difference between stereotype and cultural familiarity, is to be able to make finer distinctions than very wide and broad categories, which is in some ways a stereotype or an archetype, and in some ways and reductive also about it. And your comment about garlic scapes reminded me also that kind of two things. One, it's astonishing if you if you read at American responses, say to Italian immigrants, and they were often classified as these garlic eaters and overspiced food, which of course gave them a craving for wine, which is why they're drinking all this wine. Why it's astonishing what happens to Italian food about kind of 50, 60 years later. It is kind of elevated to the pinnacle of the best cuisine in the world. Mediterranean food is going to save us. And so there's a process by which it's almost every new group of immigrants coming in faces disdain and disgust, and then has to educate the American public to, in the Italian case, to learn how to eat broccoli rabe, olives, and you should look at the discussion in American media about Italian and then Greek. And of course, in some ways, subsequently, we are right in the middle of this oscillation about Chinese food. So kind of, do you have a sense about what is this process? Is that the responsibility of every new immigrant group to eventually expand the American palate?
Well, I'll chime in here, Krishna.
Yes,
yeah,
do that.
That's such an excellent question. I think that we are very, very far from reaching a place in society where acceptance of a food culture is acceptance of people. And to answer your question right now, it's a relationship, right? And with the relationship, it takes effort on both sides. So I think for a lot of folks, like everyone here being first or second generation, we are now entering these spaces of food media and entrepreneurship and art with our lens and our perspective, and we're able to present our culture and our food with a level of nuance and empathy and compassion, right, in hopes of bridging cultures, right, and in hopes of expanding the conversation. And while that's happening, it's going to require folks from all around us to confront their own biases, confront their own racism, confront their own ignorance, in order to actually achieve like a shared level of acceptance, right? Or to achieve more equity in this space, and in order for, I think, people to be humanized in the process of sharing food and food culture. And the thing about disgust versus desire, you know, it seems like, you know, it's like Frank was saying earlier, like the cafeteria lunchbox experience, right? I share that as well, where I used to skip my lunch and not eat because I was so embarrassed to crack open my Tupperware, and my mom would pack me like, you know, gatcaw, like caramelized fish with more fish sauce on top. It was like, you know, I would not eat.
Such yummy food, right?
Yeah, but now it's like,
yeah.
we're in a moment of desire, right? Where Vietnamese food and culture is very desired. And I think that determination, that social, that application of disgust or desire, it's totally a social construct. And I think it's heavily related to the comfort level of the dominant culture, right? Being, you know, white culture, right? Like, when I was younger, they were so uncomfortable with this food. They hadn't discovered it yet. They hadn't engaged with it yet. It wasn't accessible. So it put us in the space of disdain and disgust, right? But then once we evolved to a point in time where it's discovered by, you know, other white people, then it becomes accepted, it becomes diluted, and then accessible, it's desired, right? And so I think just being aware of the relationship of how these feelings get applied and how they're actually constructed and how that's related to, I think, levels of comfort and privilege is important to know. And in order for us to really reach a place where acceptance of culture and food and also acceptance of people, it's going to require a lot of people in positions of power and privilege to confront their own ignorance and their own biases and racism, to go beyond enjoying a meal on a plate and to see the people who have created that culture.
Excellent. Anyone
Can
want
I
to jump in? Yeah, jump in, please.
I'd love to. Sorry, Frank. But one thing that I'm thinking about is what is the goal of this, right? Like, what are we striving towards collectively? Is it acceptance within like a white supremacist paradigm? Do we want to be like step closer, like step by step towards whiteness, like the Irish, like the Italians did in the past? Or is it something else? And what does it mean to refuse that gaze and refuse that inclusion in favor of a third way out? And I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of language, since that's kind of the realm in which I exist. You know, when it comes to like the me and the us, right? Is the question, like, you know, let's say a headline is like, this is the sauce that we all need, right? Or like, you know, we might not be used to this kind of spice or whatever, right? Like, what is the we? What is the us? Is the goal to be included in the we and the us, or is the goal to kind of untangle that, right? And actually be more specific and just include all of those differences in a way that doesn't kind of elide that there are those differences. I don't know the answer to that, but I certainly know that like refusing that gaze is work, and it is unpleasant, and it is really hard, and you get a lot of pushback.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Frank,
100% agree.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
After Frank, go ahead, Frank.
Okay, after Frank, and then Jing, because I think Jing, you're having a trouble with your computer, so we'll give you a chance to come back and talk. Frank, go first, and then Sarah, and then Jing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Italian food, because I have so many names for Italian pasta shapes in my head. I've just wondered if anyone has ever gone through your head and counted how many names for Italian pasta shapes do you know? And then maybe compare that to how many names for like Chinese noodles do you know? Or Vietnamese noodles do you know? You know, and so, you know, that's a question I think about, is the pathway that Italian food has beat for Italian Americans, you know, is that available to Asian Americans, to non-white Americans? And I don't know. I think the picture that is emerging is no, you know, in immigration circles, the assimilation narrative, that assimilation is the only endpoint of immigration, is the only possible endpoint of immigration. That school of scholars is considered dated now, you know, I think. And I think, like, you know, I think a lot about the diner. I'm obsessed with diners for some reason. I think they're just full of like food that I didn't get to eat when I was a kid, you know, like breakfast. Like I just craved, you know, American breakfast when I was a kid. Like something about breakfast sausage, like made me, you know, I was like, I really like the way this tastes. And so I think about like, yeah, how did that food become American? You know, because like inclusion on a diner menu to me is some sort of signifier of Americanness or assimilation, you know, and some pretty weird food, you know, reached assimilation through diners. You know, if you think about what a chipped beef is, which is essentially like the less popular cousin of like biscuits and gravy, but it's like a sheet of dehydrated meat that's broken into chips, and then it's just kind of splashed on top of like a toothpaste like gravy and put on top of a piece of bread. So I encountered this on a diner menu in New Jersey, and I was like, what is this, you know, and why is this more American than the food I grew up eating, you know? Yeah, I've often there's a lot of Asian American diners around Los Angeles, and so there's an open question I have for those diners, because at like in Eagle Rock there's a Thai American diner called Armin's, and you know, they have like tom yum goong on the menu next to like bacon and eggs, and you know, just like traditional diner stuff, and like, yeah, I guess I don't know, like I don't know like how long tom yum goong has been on the menu. It's only been a couple of years, you know, but yeah, I doubt whether that path is available to Asian food. We seem to be able to infinitely generate, you know, any number of negative stereotypes about Asians, and that's what people, you know, refer to as the perpetual foreigner syndrome, you know, because Chinese food, you know, all kinds of Asian food have been in the States for a very long time, you know, been enjoyed for a very long time, you know. The idea of its foreignity, you know, is something that's generated in American culture, I think, and not necessarily something we can control. Yeah.
And in fact, that I was just reading some of the WPA America Eats project. I didn't realize that one of the criteria of an exclusion was exclusion of Chinese food, because somehow the WPA judged, the editor, Kellogg, judged that it had not integrated enough, though Chinese had been there at that point of time for 80, 90 years, you know? And so for me, it was like startling, even for someone who's familiar. I didn't realize how easily it could be excluded. Sarah, you wanted to come in, and then Jing.
Yeah, I just, so like, you asked such a great question, you know, about, you know, are we striving for acceptance, or are we trying to reject the gaze? I don't have the answer either. The thing that did come to mind was, for me, I feel like, you know, I'm striving to be seen, period, and then also to be seen as human, right? Because I think a lot of the way that, you know, mainstream food media and appropriators of culture, you know, engage with our culture, it's just so dehumanizing. Even the example from Jing in that headline, it was nauseating. It made me sick, really, because it was very inflammatory, and it like had a level of inciting violence, or a connection to racism and violence through, you know, chili oil, right? I think that level of just like that action around the headline is really violent, and I think that kind of is rooted in this the idea of the perpetual foreigner, as Frank was mentioning. And with that idea of the perpetual foreigner, it creates distance, right? And it also creates a hierarchy of you know, full human or inferior, or really not equal, in a sense.
Jing, do you want to? Sorry, do you want to jump in, Jing?
Yeah, do you want to finish your thought, Frank?
Oh, I was just gonna say that, like, with respect to food media, like, it is, I think, like, people don't, I don't know if, like, it understands how influential it is in an era where local media has pulled away from neighborhood coverage, you know, and so sometimes the only headlines that people will see about their neighborhoods are, it's, you know, it's a hot place to eat now, you know, and like when you like say go and report about gentrification in those neighborhoods, you know, people can cite those articles line for line, you know, they're angry about it, you know, like they Google, you know, East Hollywood, and they're like, huh, so the only thing here is the food, you know, and so it kind of exists in that context as well, in a larger journalism context where, you know, the reader is not distinguished. Like the food section is doing what the food section defines its job to be, you know, but the reader expects more because the reader can't tell that it's just a food article, you know.
I see.
So, yeah.
I see. That's a beautiful point, Jing. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, my computer screwed up earlier, so I missed a couple of things that were said, but I think, you know, I did hear something about, you know, do we kind of, you know,
Raise an issue that's important to you. Just you don't have to have heard everything.
So I mean, I think from my personal perspective, like I think, you know, standing in my truth has been really important, especially of late. And that's something that has been a lifelong journey to kind of get to this point where I've actually recently gone back to using my real name, Jing, which I was born with, but I kind of ran away from or hid from all my life, starting from when I was 5, living in Germany, kids making fun of my name, not being able to pronounce it. And it was kind of a coping mechanism. And I realized more recently that I had been kind of hiding from my own truth for a very long time. And, you know, this thing that happened with the New York Times, I probably wouldn't have said anything if it were me like 2 years ago. And so part of me, you know, coming into my own, standing in my truth, I think that's like all I can do. I think something that, you know, you brought up Italian food and how that's kind of managed to rise up the ranks over the last, you know, 100 years. When it first came to America, it was considered the dirty food. And I wonder, you know, and I agree with you, Krishnan. I think you've done some work around, you know, that perhaps it is our association with those immigrants from those countries and also their socioeconomic status. And as that kind of rises, as that kind of soft power rises, so we also see them as more human. You know, I think we were all hopeful that this would have happened with Asian cuisines until this coronavirus thing happened. But I think it is something that it's not really in a silo either. We kind of have to come at it with all different perspectives. There's other industries like fashion, entertainment, all these industries where, you know, we can come up together, then that, you know, hopefully we'll get there sooner.
Fantastic. Jenny, do you want to kind of jump into this while we slowly close and then open up for questions? Yeah.
What Soleil's question kind of prompted me to think about is also this idea of why is it that Chinese food, Asian food has not followed the same path as Italian foods? And I think partially is fundamentally because Italians now are at least still considered white, there isn't this idea, there's an assimilation idea, but there isn't a conquest idea. And I don't think that ultimately, so food media as it stands right now is okay with just assimilating Asian foods. It needs to be like this conquest. We need to understand everything about it. We need to understand all the little nuances. We need to get when there's an extraction, and whether that's kind of violent or not, I think that's, you know, that's everyone's own opinion. But I feel that there is no room for the Chinese, like, as speaking from personal experiences, like, oh, I'm a Chinese American chef, I have to do these things. We don't want to know about the things that you do that might not be Chinese. We also don't want to know about the things that you do that might, like, you know, that the white audience will not quite understand. There's always going to be this lingering feeling of there's a space in between what we understand, what you are actually saying. We can't accept that, so let's erase it. Versus like we are all together and we understand that there's individualism. So I think that anyway, there's an interesting idea there that I feel of conquest that has been specifically towards mostly communities of color that we don't really see with prior food communities and communities that maybe their foods were not considered great before, but has risen up because ultimately they were accepted.
Yeah, and also that your point raises, and Soleil's point also raises this question about, is there a specificity to xenophobia? And will we see more of it, a lot more of it? Because part of it is that China is an emergent power, economically, culturally, and in some ways, it's also part of the trope, a very Cold War, like Marco Rubio wrote that editorial. I mean, his problem was this, that China now spoiled a really nice thing. That was capitalism. We had it all. It was European, it was white, it was fun, and now everybody has jumped into it and screwed it up, right? And so that's going to be partly this kind of a racial, structural, national formation that will challenge whether this question that Frank also raised, which is Chinese food, can it follow the Italian path, maybe the Greek path? And it'll be interesting to watch some of this. Let's end here for now in terms of the direct questions. And I'll throw it to Sari for audience questions, and then we take the next round of audience questions and responses. Sari?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, everyone. There's so much to unpack here, and I obviously feel like we could all listen to all of you for the next several hours, but I do want to open it up. Your chat function is now on, so if you look at the little icon at the bottom of your screen where there's a little, I don't know what that's called, that little icon. You can go, I don't know, that little cartoony thing. You can just go ahead and start chatting questions, and then we're all going to see them. So I will wait. And I think we had one actually that came up. So let me see if I can scroll back. Okay. This one is actually for Zhang. How did the New York Times respond when you asked? Did they apologize?
So I emailed Sam Sifton, who had interviewed me, and I told him, I don't really want to be associated, my like moment of glory and forever to be associated with the coronavirus. Like, is that the only reason why, I was even included? So I just said, there's already been this negative association of Chinese food with coronavirus, and, can you change it to quarantine? And he was like, oh, that's an interesting point. I will take this to the editors. And 5 minutes later, he's told me the editors had changed it. It's now quarantine cooking online, but I guess they failed to change it before it went to print. So the print still says coronavirus cooking, unfortunately. They did not apologize.
Hey, Sari, can't hear you. You're okay.
Yes, thank you. Well, yeah, okay, sorry about that. Okay, Jackson asks, what role do you see for personalities such as Eddie Huang? I don't know who wants to take that one. Feel free to chime in. Nobody wants to.
Frank is going to take it.
Okay.
Frank is taking it.
Oh, I am? Okay.
No,
Well, I just, I read Eddie Huang's book when it first came out. I'm Taiwanese. Eddie's Taiwanese too. I definitely related to the book as well, and I think Eddie was, in some ways a real trailblazer in a different era. Yeah, like Eddie Huang, in some ways was trying to pick up the torch that Anthony Bourdain and Jonathan was kind of passing off, yeah. I guess that's all I got. Sorry.
Yeah, I in fact think he's representative of the churning in the field. That in fact, I was excited to see his work disrupt a presumption that basically people who travel to other cultures and eat and comment on it are all going to be white and male most of the time.
Yeah,
so that it was disruptive. It was it was a lot of fun, and it was funny. And of course, it also has a kind of a masculine swagger, and it's kind of, and all the aspects of it, productive and unproductive, like all of us. I see part of my work, some of it productive, some of it is going to be unproductive because we are that kind of a social subject, partly with some degrees of autonomy and partly trapped in a world not of our own making. In that sense, very Heideggerian, thrown into the world that is already constituted. So we'll have to kind of wrestle with this thing, and we do some of it well, some of it badly, some of it stupidly, and each one of us. And so I personally see it as, in fact, the breaking of the crust of where there was, in some ways, much greater homogeneity about what good taste was going to be. And he is part of the disruptors. as in fact most people on this panel. Sari?
Thanks for that. Yeah, okay, lots of great questions coming in. Kathy asks, can we talk about the emotional labor that is associated with defending your food? Is that a mantle you've taken up in your roles? And when is it okay to just say no? And she also adds, also the emotional labor and teaching others about food. Maybe Soleil wants to kick this one off, or whoever wants to chime in.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm lucky in that I do get compensated for that emotional labor, which is I'm very fortunate about. So yeah, I think like it's complicated, right? Like if you don't do it, who's going to do it, right? So to be silent, of course, is a choice that you are welcome to make for your own, well-being. But there are certainly some fights that I have chosen not to get into, like the whole Alice and Roman thing. I've chosen not to have any, I could have written many hot takes about it. Frank knows this too. But I was having a good day and I wanted to have a good day and I didn't want to deal with it. So, I mean, yes, it is up to you to do that. But at the same time, I think there are so many now people who are empowered to speak up about this stuff that like reliably, like, maybe you can speak behind the scenes about it. You can commiserate. There's so many like spaces where that's okay now, where like you have that privacy and that freedom. You can express yourself in that way. You don't necessarily have to take up the fight like in that world, not of our own making, as Christina and Heidegger puts it. You don't have to fight that battle, but you can at least like find solidarity with other people around that thing. And that's probably going to be a lot more emotionally fulfilling because you don't have to explain so much.
And also, I think it's situational, right? Which is some days, my attitude towards it, people assume I know yoga because I was born in India and raised in India. I know nothing about yoga. And sometimes I react with that bristliness saying, I don't know anything about yoga and I cannot provide you a solution to that authentic moment. And other moments, I totally try to become this ambassador and try to explain and over-explain. Most Indians are not vegetarian, though you think they are vegetarian. That 70% of Indians are not vegetarian. That India has one of the largest Muslim minority. And there are more Muslims in India than in the Middle East and in South Asia. And how Indian vegetarianism becomes a tool then to beat up Indian Muslims. So sometimes I get into this and I get riled up and wrestle with it. And as Soleil said, I'm finding it beautiful now that on most issues, I'm not called on to comment on. And I love it, that I can choose and pick and ignore like a lot of the stuff that happens in the world out there. Fantastic question.
I also just want to say that there is depending on how you want to educate people, you can also determine at what level you want to educate them on. You can, for example, one of my dinners, one of the courses is called Model Minority, which most Asian Americans all know what that means. However, the white people who attend might not. And I decide that I'm not going to explain it to them. If they want to know before my explanation, which does come in form at some point in the dinner, I tell them to ask either someone else or look it up themselves. And I just kind of go from the assumption that they have already done that work. And I do think that's kind of my stance on education is as long as like I ask them first to do the work themselves, and then I will educate them past a certain point that I have determined is comfortable for me.
Beautiful, beautifully put. I mean, like Salman Rushdie says, he's not going to translate every Hindi word, Bombaya word in his novel. Just as like I read Keats and I read Shakespeare and I figured out what a daffodil is. I'd never seen a damn daffodil. And a nightingale, or the Grecian urn. And so put some work into it. And so I think that engagement I have a lot more toleration if you put some work into it and you don't know and you don't understand. So for curiosity and engagement. But if you want to just swagger into it and I have to over translate and you don't have to put in any effort into it, that gets monumentally irritating and lazy.
Yeah, I would just say like Googling is a perfectly acceptable thing to ask for. That's why I know like 45 different pasta shaped names, because on the Italian restaurant menu, they're not giving you any help. You gotta know what all this means, and so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Daniel. Are there any policies or laws that seem to impact food in a way that promotes xenophobia and racism with or without intention? I'm not sure if they mean historically or presently, but maybe Chris, you want to kick us off with that?
I mean, yes, of course. I think it depends a lot on political leadership, and you can see it. You can see it. The AAPI is recording anti-Chinese bias, and when our president kept calling it the Chinese virus, and et cetera, there were from March 15 to April 19. There were 1,500 cases of anti-Asian violence. Okay. And for some reason, and this is partly the side of hope, he has become less utterly attentive to this part of it. Maybe he's distracted by other things. And the last month, those numbers are now 300 have been added to those 1,200 that had been there. So leadership clearly matters in terms of, I mean, two things. In terms of what you are allowed to say in a public space. Okay, I censor myself all the time for good reasons, and that's okay. Not to say the stupidest sexist thing that might come to my mind because of my socialization. Okay, and so it's okay to temper it, and that is two things: rules, laws, and modeling of behavior by political leaders, and we will see the change maybe after the next election, or maybe not.
Something that came to mind about laws is, I can't remember how many years ago this was, but in New York there was a food law that was passed that you couldn't handle raw food with hands without gloves. And obviously this caused an uproar in sushi restaurants, because for many sushi chefs, the whole point is that they are understanding the texture of the fish and the quality of the fish through their hands. They cannot do that with gloves. It was a whole thing. But I think that was because that's something that we don't eat frequently, that was this kind of, maybe it was not meant to be racist, but it ended up having a disproportionate impact upon certain, cultural foods. And that's something that I think doesn't get covered enough, because we don't like to see ourselves in that way. We were just trying to make food handling safer. We don't recognize the overall impact.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I'd add to that is I kind of look at laws as not like as something that generates xenophobia or racism themselves. They're an expression of xenophobia and racism, and like over time, laws targeting Asian foods or regulations had to be changed so that Asian food could exist. Like, for example, food temperature regulations meant that you couldn't legally sell crispy duck, in a Cantonese roast pork shop. It also meant that you couldn't sell Korean rice cakes, because Korean rice cakes were sold at room temperature as well. And so, because of the way that, history has, driven Asian immigrants towards food, and the expression, and there's been a system of laws against Asian foods and Asian culture in general that are an expression of that xenophobia, I think.
Thanks. Okay. This is from Pixel. The question is, fake meats coming from China, why are, I guess, mostly Westerners, why do they not demonize those kind of vegetarian meat substitutes and tofus that originate from China, and why instead are, Asian foods that are more, culturally understood to be Chinese, those kinds of foods demonized?
That's a lovely question.
Well, I think there's like a question of like who owns vegan cuisine, and I think that's a totally other, like a different panel, which I would love to watch. But it's more like who gets to be a vegan, who gets to own, the origins of that practice. And I think there are a lot of vegans of color who have like different stories than the kind of mainstream veganism, which can, can sometimes like blur into like racism and xenophobia through, demonizing practices like the dog eating, right? Or even, any sort of like the practice of making fish sauce. I remember this spat a while ago from this like vegan company that made a vegan fish sauce that showed pictures of the process of making it and said that, oh, isn't this gross? Like, don't you not want to participate in this? That's not really the way to like win people of color to your cause. Wouldn't think, but like, you know, I think like any group of people in Western society, right, they're susceptible to a lot of these like sort of Orientalist, colonialist like ways of thinking. And I think that, you know, the question kind of touches on that of just, you know, tofu has been appropriated pretty effectively, tempeh has been appropriated pretty effectively and kind of divorced from its original context. And that's just how it works.
Yeah. And I think your first point, right, which is get familiar with the diversity and the range. I mean, tofu and tempeh, like dog food, dog meat, is a range of users, and most elaborated in parts of Asia that we depend on in terms of vegetarian proteins. Sari?
Yeah, okay, thanks. This is from Deanna. They live in a relatively diverse part of Vancouver, Canada. I feel that my relatives and friends are pretty good about differentiating Asian cuisines, but everything else would be white food, even Caribbean or Jamaican. When put in that situation, how often would you choose to speak up to why it's not white food? It feels like putting the assumption to the dominant culture. Anyone want to jump in? Do I have to name names?
I would just say that, yeah, like you should push back on that idea, though I don't know if you'll succeed, because it's something that is very, you know, embedded in immigrant culture, that you know, American culture is white culture and American culture is not you. And I think about this a lot, like, how can I convince immigrants that you belong here? You know, you should have everything that I have, that all the conversations should also include you too, you know. And I think there's a number of reasons that immigrants feel that way, because when you get to the States, like, there's so many things that reinforce that you're not a part of things, that you're not included, you know. And so it is a persistent, you know, and you know, pesty idea that is really hard to uproot.
Thanks, Frank. First of all, I just want to thank everyone who's writing in and also including their pronouns. That's super helpful. And also, I'm going to read a few more questions, but if everyone would just take a moment and just chat in the box and let us know where you're from. It's always really interesting to see where everyone is writing in from and watching in from. Okay, this is from Selena. Thinking about Soleil's comment about what it might look like for us to separate ourselves from the we that is white-centric, and wondering how this may translate to class. How do you see folks of different classes participating and contributing to food culture, especially those whose first language might not be English? It's great. Do you want to respond to that, Krish?
I thought it was for Soleil.
Well, in response to Soleil's comment.
Yeah. No, I would say absolutely. And I think in some ways, the worst way to limits to the American imagination is really imagining class difference. It's like everybody wants to be middle class and everybody is middle class. So there's an unspecificity to it, which is like Asia and like Asians or like India or like Indians, which at that level, it's a useless category, the middle class. And it's very crucial, very important. So, and this is also linked to some of the other categories that we have talked about before. For me, it is much more productive to get a little further down into this kind of scale of things we are talking about, okay? And so in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, and the more specific you can get, I mean, I call it the richness of vernacular cuisines. Think about accents, think about various languages in which, everyday languages in which people engage with each other. And closer we get to the vernacular, abstract categories that do a lot of violence, like something called Asian, right? Which can be contingent, owned for a moment, but still in some ways food. What exactly is Asian food? And so the level of specification, including class specification. And I think that is one of the underrated discussions still, and that is my allergy to the foodie world, where the foodie world wipes away class, and its omnivorousness is about all kinds of ethnic and racial difference with no self-consciousness about class. And I think class is an important divider, as location, as language, as ethnicity, as race. and our analytical categories have to wrestle them down.
Can I, oh no,
Oh,
sorry,
Soleil, after you. No, you go, Soleil. I'll chime in after.
Okay, thanks. So for me, the major kind of swerve that I've been trying to really thoughtfully go into is thinking more purposefully and more often about immigration status, about people who are undocumented and just how they're kind of surviving and participating in this system. You know, I think that there, you know, it kind of goes back to that first question too about like laws or policies that might perpetuate inequity. And I think an important kind of angle to something that recently happened in Los Angeles, for instance, with shelter in place, was the government just kind of put a crackdown on all street vendors, which are largely, you know, operated and owned by undocumented people, by women, by the elderly, you know, people who don't traditionally have the means like social media or whatever to have like, or investors to open traditional kinds of restaurants or survive. So thinking about that and continuing to ask, like, what's happening with people who we're not seeing right now on Instagram or Twitter or whatever? Like, how are they doing? Like, just being more thoughtful about the questions you're asking and the people that you're paying attention to. Because once all those people start looking the same, right, or talking the same, then you know you have a problem. Like, you're not paying attention.
Excellent point.
Just real quickly, I'll add to that. Selena, thank you for your question. That's such an excellent, thoughtful question. Personally, I feel that, you know, folks of different classes, especially folks from immigrant backgrounds, and especially folks who are part of the undocumented community, have so much value and richness to contribute to food culture. And they're often the ones who are teaching so many of us who didn't have the opportunity or the platform to elevate it to a wider audience, right? So I think what we can do as a community is for folks who are engaging with food or engaging with businesses or restaurants that are owned and operated by different classes or even by immigrants. It's again, it comes down to like how we hold them and how we value them and how we perceive them, and not assigning, you know, any level of value or any level of hierarchy to folks who are contributing so much to food culture because of their class or their immigrant status or citizenship status or immigrant background.
I would just say quickly, in fact, class is one of the ultimate taboos in American culture.
Thank you. Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna read one more question because we're a little bit over time. Last one, this is from Terrence Lee. In the economic aftermath of COVID, it seems the younger, more tech savvy, widely accepted, acclaimed restaurants will be the best positioned to survive. What do you think would be lost in the loss of the older, more authentic mom and pop restaurants in the quest to normalize Asian cuisine or achieve wider acceptance? And how critical is it to preserve them? Or do you think the younger generation is up to the task of advancing the cuisine? I'd really like to hear from Zhang first.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And it's something, it echoes a similar theme that's been happening throughout in China for the last like couple of decades. There's been a lot of talk about like the old guard of Chinese cooking, and you know, because Chinese chefs traditionally have been known to keep secrets, like keep their recipes secret, not pass down those secrets. And I've seen that personally at work, being, you know, working in the restaurant industry in China. And there's always this like kind of feeling amongst the older generation that young people are not up to the task, and that so much is being lost with every generation. And the thing is, like, if you look back in history with Chinese cuisine, I'm just speaking from like Sichuan cuisine for one example, it's a constant evolution, and there's a constantly been an adopting of different influences as, you know, people immigrated in and out of Sichuan. Even the chili pepper didn't arrive into Sichuan until a couple hundred years ago, and what we think of as classical Sichuan cuisine today, like the mapo tofus, the, you know, twice cooked porks, they didn't exist more than 100 years ago. And so it just really illustrates that, you know, I think that the best way for cuisines to continuously evolve is or to stay alive is to continuously evolve. And you know, I wonder if COVID hadn't happened, I mean, the older generation will have to eventually stop, whether it's COVID or some other reason. And so I think holding on to tradition or the way that things have been done is almost detrimental to a cuisine's growth, because if it doesn't grow, it actually dies. If we don't have that younger generation taking the helm, and you know, even if it morphs into something a little different, I think it risks dying.
Does anyone else want to respond to that question?
Just real briefly, as I'm thinking about this question from Terrence, you know, as someone who's a part of like the younger generation or this generation, I personally would love to be in conversation with the folks we're talking about. Like, I would like to be in conversation with folks who are the older generation and are of the mom and pop restaurants. Like, what do they want? You know, like, do they just want to retire and say, hey, we did our thing? Or are they like, I wish my kids would forward my legacy? Like, I'm guilty of this as well. Like, I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh, I've actually never spoken to any of like the folks in, you know, in the mom and pop restaurants that I used to frequent. So I don't even know how they're thinking, you know, what they're thinking, what they want. And I think I'm going back to the previous question about, you know, different classes and immigrant backgrounds. As we're talking about folks who are of different classes and of immigrant backgrounds, let's find ways to include them in the conversation and hear from them as well as to like what they're thinking, what they want for our collective future as well.
Great. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I guess that we've come to the end of this night. I'm so sorry for those of you who had questions that we didn't get to. Clearly this panel is so thoughtful and engaging. We could chat with them all night long, but I won't do that to them. I'll let them go, maybe eat some dinner or continue with their night. But for those that didn't hear at the beginning, there has been a live Twitter of this conversation. So if you want to keep engaging, I would direct you to, well, I guess we're on the internet, but to Twitter specifically. If you feel like there's momentum there and you want to keep talking about this, please feel free. Also, I wanted to remind you that we did record this, so this video will be up tomorrow on the MOFAD site, so you can go back and revisit and share with your friends. You can also watch the panel conversation that we had a week ago, which addressed a lot of those issues that just came up. We did have some of those representatives from the elder generation talking about Chinese restaurants on both coasts, as well as the younger generation. If you missed that, I really encourage you. It was a fantastic conversation. So thank you so much to everyone on our panel it's just such an honor to be witness to this conversation. And thank you to everyone who participated. We really feel the community, and you were so thoughtful and engaging. So thank you all. Please stay safe and keep following MOFAD and keep coming to our online programs, and we'll be talking soon. So good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Are we leaving?